But then let's move on to our next speaker, Aletia Fernandez de la Reguera. Aletia, I think just before I give I think you're worth a long introduction, and I wanted to note there that it seemed very interesting that you have done for your PhD, you did a dissertation where you were talking about the autonomy processes for decision making of Mexican female migrant workers who were returning from the US. And I think we will throw in a bit of spotlighting for you to take us a little bit into what this sort of means in terms of the objective that we have in front of us. You know, female migrants, their vulnerabilities, and how that is plugged into the assessment. But before I do that, let me just, and before I introduce your question, let me just introduce Alethia to our audience here. Alethia is an associate researcher at the Institute of Legal Research at the National Autonomous University of Mexico, UNAM, and where she coordinates the National Laboratory on Diversities. And mostly her research looks at the study of gender immigration policies, the institutional violence, as well as looking at immigration detention processes. And she's coordinating the Erasmus MA program, which looks at Euroculture at the University of Mexico, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. And she has, for the last 5 years, been a guest scholar at another program, which is at the University of Lille in France, that looks at transnational migrations. And she obtained her PhD with honors in humanistic studies from the Tecnológico de Monterrey, with a dissertation, as I mentioned, which looked at the autonomy processes of decision-making of Mexican female migrant workers that were returning from the US. She has an MA in European Studies from the University of Amsterdam and a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations, as well as having been a member of different networks of researchers. She also collaborates a university seminar on international displacement, migration, exile, and repatriation at her university. She's part of UNESCO's technical chair on the ethics and peace studies, and a board member of the Institute of Women in Migration based in Mexico City. Alethia, for us, I mean, I made sure to mention all the research experience because I think we would like to bring this discussion in that way. I mean, we would say that in the broad sense, and if we look at sort of, for instance, forced migration, we can see that it is characterized really by a large number of migrants who are in need of international protection. And on the other side, you see enforcement of policies that try to criminalize and also to detain migrants and immigrants. So what would be the main challenges that you see posed by Objective 12? And here we would sort of really like you to look at things like accountability and transparency of migration procedures, and also the kind of capacity building efforts that are going, whether it's looking at training of officials, whether it's also looking at counseling for migrants, and also trying to bring in, as Stefan had just said, this sort of gender responsive and child sensitive referral mechanisms, which are obviously the gold standard, but how is that coming in? So from your research experience, it would be good for us to get a good sense also of the recommendations on how we can strengthen these legal certainty and predictability in migration procedures. And also, like I said, coming in from that gender lens. Over to you, Alethia.
Thank you very much, Patty. And it is a great pleasure to be with you all. Here in Mexico, it's 6 a.m. in the morning. So I'm very happy to be with you today. Yeah, regarding like the challenges of Objective 12, I totally agree with Stefan that some of the main points of these objectives already existed before the Global Compact. Many countries already had these protocols to enforce accountability and transparency, and also, of course, the gender sensitive and child sensitive procedures. Together with all the different aspects of Objective 12. But I believe that one of the main challenges that we're seeing, of course, that I am talking from my own perspective, as you said, Patty, I am a sociologist and I do a lot of field work but I study like the Mexican and the US and the Central American region. But I also studied the European region as well, not directly, but I think we share some aspects. Unfortunately, I am not an expert in all regions, and I would have loved to understand more what's happening in India. But the reality is that we're seeing that detention procedures are growing every day, and that depending on the region, of course, but this is part of some particular situation that, like that these mixed flows that are expressed in the Objective 12, the reality is that we're seeing like new structural features of mobility. I believe that sometimes international law is left behind, like with these categories of understanding the difference between a labor migrant and a forced migrant. And I believe that a big challenge in terms of accountability and transparencies, it happens in transit countries, because many people, many migrants in reality are forced migrants. And I believe that we need to think on a global governance of migration in terms of what are the priorities and the needs for these people. What's happening in the transit countries? One of the main problems that we also observe is that some of the main obstacles are faced in the access of the territory. Some people don't even have the right to access territory in destination countries. So I would highlight the importance of think about Objective 12 in terms of transit countries and the point of access to the destination countries. With this also, in this era of externalization of borders, we must say that this is a big challenge for international law and for the Objective 12. The other point that I would like to highlight, and maybe we can discuss further, is that there is this public and this global discourse that criminalize immigrants. Immigrants are stigmatized as criminals, as sick people. Now with the COVID pandemic, we're seeing how this crisis that we saw in 2014 in Europe, and that we're seeing now since 2018 in the Americas, with the exodus of people that are fleeing from violence, from death. Now it is accentuated by this discourse of they are not only dangerous, but they are also sick. They might bring COVID-19. So these particular situations of crisis, they enforce the criminalization of migrants. So I would like to highlight the effects of this public and this global discourse that criminalize and stigmatize migrants, and the effects of this discourse in all different levels of the procedures that are approached in Objective number 12. And finally, because I know we don't have much time, but I think it's very important to understand, if we already have these procedures, this training, we understand we need protocols for accountability, etc. What's one of the main obstacles for us? What we're seeing is a discretionary use of policies. We do have trained agents, we do have trained officials, we do have, like I said, gender responsive and child sensitive referral protocols, but there are still discretionary use of policies, because many of the laws, of national laws, immigration laws, they have this particularity that in some occasions, in some situations, the agents can decide whether or not to refer with a gender sensitive or child sensitive protocol, or whether or not they decide if this person is really a labor migrant or is a person who is a forced migrant. And then the referral mechanism changes completely. So I would say, like, the third challenge for me would be, what about the discretionary use of agents, and what is the role of the subjectivities of these officials within the whole process of referral? And I think I'll stop there. Thank you, Patty.
Alethia, thank you for that. And I think, like you said, we would need to get back to that last question. I think that stands quite crucial, sort of the discretionary use that I think for me just goes even beyond migration policy, but also national policies that you have in sort of trying to really make a distinction between them and us. And I think we are also seeing this sort of the discretionary use of policy in terms of how urban migration is also being managed there, and who has access to what then at the end of the day, especially in the times of COVID, when we've sort of seen those who are part of a vulnerable group and migrants can sort of, because of the lack of law that goes to protect them directly, can sort of be left out. And it's sort of a deliberate, you would say it's a deliberate move that's been made by tagging into policies that would not normally look like a migration policy. In this case, in terms of access, for instance, to health provisions or even education, as it has been in some cases, especially with the COVID pandemic highlighting this. So I think we should come back to that and sort of try to dive a little bit into it. And in this, I would say maybe also looking at, the kind of work that you have done and kind of work on research. Have you seen these vulnerabilities then that come with being disadvantaged by policy, or being the previous point that you made in terms of criminalization of migration, how that then impacts on women? Does that impact on women and girls a bit more differently? What does that sort of mean? And maybe even if you wanted to go into some very, let's say, human story examples of how this can be highlighted and how it's actually magnified as a female migrant in terms of the impact that it has, because you don't have a proper assessment of your vulnerabilities, and the law misses that, or the law is not very clear about how that is done.